Photography is a very melancholic practice, or at least it is when I do it. But I'm not alone in thinking that. A photograph has a relationship to mortality that a movie film doesn't. When one watches one of those great Hollywood musicals from the 1940s or 50s, even though everyone on the screen may be dead, you are carried away by the film. You're wrapped up in the narrative of the story. The characters are singing, dancing, and there's literally no time for you to dwell on the individual fate of the actors. But a photographic image is different. Looking at a photograph is an inherently reflective process, a meditation on a past moment in time, evoking memory, reverie, dreams and impressions. Consequently, a feeling of sadness can be very close to the surface, particularly if one is remembering a moment or an event, a person, or even a place that is lost or that is irreparably changed. I think we've all experienced this. When we find an old photograph, perhaps of a birthday party or a family holiday taken years ago, if there are people in the image that have died, or perhaps the children in the photo are now parents with children of their own, or even if we simply see a much younger, barely remembered image of ourselves, there is inevitably, at best, a wistful remembrance of the way things were. The photograph brings that moment of the past into the present, with all the turbulence of emotions that may bring with it. This can be true even of commercial photography. Think of a magazine advert for the latest Apple iPhone or BMW. If we see this again in 15 years from now, we will either be scornful of the antiquated rubbish we once bought, or feel nostalgic about how stylish such products were back in the day. How much more evocative, then, are photographs of people and places we actually know? The Victorians were intimately acquainted with the presence of death. It permeated their society that I think is still difficult for us to comprehend. People had huge families because most children would die before they were 5 years old. TB, typhus, diphtheria, a whole smorgasbord of diseases could take you out at any time, and the newly invented photographic print became a popular way of commemorating the recently deceased. The young girl on the left in this image is actually dead, and she's being propped up. Such post-mortem photographs were not uncommon in Victorian society. It was a way of remembering, commemorating the dead, and a very real reminder that a family consisted not just in living family members, but also the deceased. On this image, the open eyes have actually been painted on to the photograph itself. This might seem almost callous to us today, but the closeness of death, I think, gave the Victorians a very matter-of-fact attitude towards it, that our insulated healthcare age we might find problematic. But of course, memento moris have a very long history, as long as mankind probably, and certainly the ancient Egyptians would have understood Victorian attitudes to remembrance very well indeed. The celebrated Fayum portraits of Egypt, done mainly from the 1st to the 4th centuries AD, so that's when Egypt was under Roman occupation. The portraits of the dead, usually of noble Egyptian or Greek families, and these would be attached to the mummies or the sarcophaguses, and often these would be propped up in the family's living room for a final chance to say farewell before burial. The painters are unknown, unfortunately, because it's quite clear that some of them were very highly gifted artists, although they probably saw themselves merely as technicians or craft workers fulfilling a service. I think you'll agree that it's a small step to go from these Fayum portraits to the memorial photographic portraits that are mounted on many gravestones today. Here in France particularly, it's a very common phenomenon, and I think it is elsewhere, particularly in Catholic cemeteries across the whole of Europe. I must admit I'm quite fascinated by this sort of thing. It's not something I think I'd want on my own gravestone. The idea that one's whole life and physical development, from chubby childhood through youthful beauty to middle-aged elegance to decrepit old age, can be summed up in a single image, and evidently not always the most flattering image, is not appealing to me personally. I look at these faces, these postures, some informal snapshots, others seem very formal, and I wonder perhaps if some were taken on the deceased's wedding day. It's quite shocking really that your image taken at 1/100th of a second at a particular instant of your life, whether it's an important instant or not important at all, will sit on your headstone for decades after your death, and indeed the image might last longer than your entire life. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but of course such things are for the benefit of the living, not the dead. These images that may have been throwaway snapshot photographs in life take on huge import and poignancy in this context. We become very sensitive when viewing these photographs. We feel we know these people, we see them every day. The images here come from my local cemetery, so occasionally one really does recognize these people. We also recognize ourselves in the portraits. We feel our own mortality, and however briefly, we can't help imagining our faces in place of theirs. Believe it or not, I started this video with the intention of talking about landscape. But I see I've spoken for over 7 minutes and still haven't arrived at the meat of my subject. So I think I'll wrap it up here and we'll continue in part 2.